The day Marcus Johnson found two strangers living in his farmhouse, he didn't call the police. He made them coffee instead. It wasn't supposed to be this way. None of it was. The farmhouse was supposed to be his fresh start, the place where he'd rebuild the life that had crumbled around him after Sarah died. 3 years of single parenthood had taught him that plans were just wishes written in disappearing ink. But this was different. This was supposed to be the one thing that went right. Marcus had first seen the property on a grey Thursday afternoon in October, driving back from another disappointing parent-teacher conference where his daughter, Emma's teacher, had used words like withdrawn and struggling to connect. The farmhouse sat at the end of a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance. Since the Reagan administration, its paint peeling like sunburned skin, shutters hanging at defeated angles. Most people would have seen a wreck. Marcus saw possibility. "It's got good bones," the realtor had said, which Marcus had learned was code for everything else is garbage. But the price was right, suspiciously right. And the 10 acres came with an old barn, a creek that still ran clear, and enough distance from the city that Emma might remember what silence sounded like. He'd bought it with the insurance money, the money that came with Sarah's death, the money that felt like blood money even though it wasn't, the money that sat in his account like an accusation for 2 years, before he finally decided to let it become something else. Something better. The plan was simple. Spend 6 months renovating on weekends, move in by summer. Give Emma a childhood that didn't smell like apartment hallway curry and sound like sirens at 2 a.m. He'd hired a contractor who quoted him a price that made his stomach hurt, then disappeared after the first week with a deposit and a disconnected phone number. So Marcus did what he always did. He figured it out himself. Every Saturday for 3 months, he'd load Emma into his 10-year-old pickup and drive the 90 minutes to the farmhouse. While he ripped out rotted floorboards and replaced broken windows, Emma would sit in the truck cab doing homework, her face reflected in the window glass like a ghost of the happy child she used to be. Sometimes she'd help him, handing him tools with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions. And he'd try to remember what her laugh sounded like. By January, he'd made real progress. New roof, updated electrical, plumbing that didn't require prayer before use. The place was starting to look less like a horror movie set and more like a home. He'd stood in the empty living room one Sunday evening, smelling sawdust and possibility. And for the first time since Sarah's funeral, he'd felt something like hope. Then his supervisor announced mandatory overtime. 6 weeks minimum, no exceptions. The promotion Marcus had been chasing for 2 years finally came through, but it meant 60-hour weeks and no weekend trips. He'd called Emma's grandparents, Sarah's parents, who still looked at him sometimes like he should have died instead of their daughter, and arranged for them to take Emma on Saturdays. He'd promised himself he'd get back to the farmhouse as soon as the overtime ended. 6 weeks turned into 8. 8 turned into 10. Spring arrived while Marcus was buried under spreadsheets and conference calls, and the farmhouse waited. When he finally made it back on a Saturday in late April, the sky was that particular shade of blue that makes promises it can't keep. Emma had actually smiled that morning when he told her they were going to the farm, and he'd felt like maybe, just maybe, they were finally turning a corner. The truck rattled down the dirt road and Marcus noticed the grass had been cut. He frowned. Maybe a neighbor being helpful? But then he saw the curtains in the windows, his windows, which hadn't had curtains 10 weeks ago. The confusion sharpened into something else when he spotted a rusted Honda Civic, parked behind the barn. His hand was on his phone, ready to call the police when the front door opened. She was maybe 60, with steel grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and a dish towel over one shoulder. Behind her stood a younger woman, mid-20s probably, with frightened eyes and a baby on her hip. "You must be Marcus," the older woman said, like she'd been expecting him. "I'm Diane. This is Crystal and her daughter Lily. I suppose we should talk." Emma grabbed Marcus's hand, something she hadn't done in months. The story came out over coffee that Diane made in Marcus's kitchen, using Marcus's coffee maker that he definitely hadn't left behind. Diane had been a nurse for 35 years before her hospital downsized her into unemployment. At 62, she was too young for retirement, too old for anyone to hire. She'd lost her apartment 3 months ago. Crystal had been living out of her car with baby Lily when they met at a shelter. The shelter had a 2-week limit. After that, you were someone else's problem. We weren't trying to squat, Diane said, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. We were just trying to survive. Someone at the church mentioned this place had been sitting empty. The county records showed you owned it, but she gestured around the room. It looked abandoned. We thought maybe a few weeks, just until we figured something out. Marcus should have been angry. He wanted to be angry. Anger was clean, simple, justifiable. These women had broken into his property, his fresh start, his carefully constructed plan for saving his daughter from grief. But Emma was sitting on the floor making faces at baby Lily, and the sound coming out of her mouth was laughter, actual laughter. He'd forgotten what it sounded like. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 5 weeks, Crystal said quietly. She was young up close, maybe too young to have the kind of exhaustion living in her eyes. "We fixed the broken step. Diane's handy. We didn't take anything that was here. We can show you." "The grass," Marcus interrupted. "I found a push mower in the barn," Diane said. "Figured it was the least we could do." Marcus stood up and walked to the window. The property looked better than when he'd left it. The flower beds Sarah had loved in the photos he'd seen. Someone had cleared them. Planted something new. The fence he'd been meaning to repair had been repaired. "Dad." Emma appeared beside him, still holding Lily's tiny hand. "Can the baby stay?" That's when it hit him. The realization that made his chest tight and his eyes burn. He'd been so focused on building a place for Emma that he'd forgotten what she actually needed. Not walls and windows, not a creek and 10 acres. She needed what every kid needed, what he'd needed when Sarah died and thought he'd never find again. She needed people, connection, purpose beyond grief. "I have a proposition," Marcus heard himself say, the words forming before his brain caught up. "I need help finishing this place, real help, and I need someone to be here during the week when I can't be, to make sure everything stays on track." Diane's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the barn has a separate apartment above it. Needs work, but it's livable. I'm saying I can't pay much, but I can pay something. I'm saying—" He looked at Crystal, at the baby, at the hope trying not to hope on Diane's face. "I'm saying I bought this place to build a home, but maybe I've been thinking too small about what that means." Crystal started crying. Diane stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "You don't know us," Diane said. "We broke into your property. For all you know, you fixed my step," Marcus said. "You planted flowers. You made my daughter laugh for the first time in 6 months." He turned to face them both. "Look, I don't know you, but I know what it's like to need help and be too proud to ask for it. I know what it's like to be drowning and have someone throw you a rope." The next 3 months blurred together in the best possible way. Diane moved into the barn apartment and proved to be exactly the kind of take charge presence the project needed. Crystal, who'd dropped out of college when she got pregnant, turned out to have an eye for design that transformed Marcus's practical renovations into something actually beautiful. Emma bloomed like the flowers in Sarah's garden. She taught Lily to walk in the backyard while Diane taught Marcus about patience and Crystal taught all of them about second chances. The farmhouse became what Marcus had hoped, a home, just not the home he'd imagined. It became louder, messier, fuller. It became a place where Diane made Sunday dinners that fed 5 instead of 2, where Crystal took online classes at the kitchen table while Lily napped, where Emma stopped being the ghost of a happy child and became an actual happy child again. On the day they officially finished the main house, Marcus stood in the same living room where he'd felt hope that January evening. But this time he wasn't alone. Diane was directing Crystal on where to hang pictures. Emma was reading to Lily in the corner. The smell wasn't sawdust anymore. It was cookies, because Diane believed every major life event required cookies. "Thank you," Crystal said quietly, appearing beside him. Lily was asleep against her shoulder, tiny fingers clutching her mother's shirt. You gave us our lives back. Marcus shook his head. You gave me mine, because that's what he'd learned in the months since, finding two strangers in his farmhouse. You can't build a home alone. You can construct a house. Sure, 4 walls and a roof. All the technical requirements met. But a home requires something else. It requires the mess and chaos of actual human beings, the complicated beauty of people helping each other survive. He'd bought an abandoned farmhouse thinking he'd find a fresh start. Instead, he'd found something better. He'd found family. The kind you choose. The kind that chooses you back. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Marcus sat on the porch and called Sarah's parents. He told them about Diane and Crystal and Lily, about how Emma was doing in school now, about the farmhouse that had become so much more than he'd planned. Sarah would have loved this, his mother-in-law said, her voice soft. She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever met. After he hung up, Marcus sat in the silence that wasn't silent anymore, crickets singing, the creek running, voices and lives filling the spaces grief had left empty. He thought about the person he'd been when he bought this place, so focused on his own plan that he couldn't see past it. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never planned for. Sometimes strangers become family. Sometimes what looks like an ending is actually just a different kind of beginning. The farmhouse lights glowed warm against the darkness, and Marcus finally understood what home really meant.